Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We have a super expert panel today to talk about, maybe I should say debate, a topic that's top of mind, I think, for every manager today, which is how do you get candidates to say yes? And also how do you make sure that your superstars stay in seat? I am Caitlin Allen, your moderator. And before we introduce our amazing speakers, in the chat, if you could introduce yourself, your title, and the role you most need to hire, that would be fabulous. And if you're comfortable, something we've seen work well recently is to also include your LinkedIn URL so that people can help you find the roles that you need to hire and connect with you. We'd love to play a role in helping you find that next rockstar team member. Quick logistics, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be shared with you tomorrow over email. And next week, you'll also receive a a guide that is a PDF that dives into the content that we are going to talk about today. And lastly, while we have time at the end for questions, our webinar chats tend to be pretty lively and engaged. So send your thoughts and questions there. And if you have anything you want to send to me directly via the question submission function, you can do that too. My job is to adjust the conversation to include the things that you want us to cover. So thank you in advance for that. Now, as I introduce our speakers, we've got some experts and startup operators. As I mentioned, I'm Caitlin. I get to enjoy every day leading and working with the marketing team at OpenComp. And for those of you that are new, we partner with over 3,000 of the world's fastest growing companies in the pre-IPO space on the topic of compensation intelligence to help them answer questions like, how can we stop losing talent or unnecessarily burning cash? As far as our guests go, Beth is first up. She lives in California and is currently the head of talent at Homebrew, which is a really well-known seed stage venture firm that helps companies become fantastic startups, like the names that we all consider household names today. And before that, she led recruiting functions at Google and Salesforce to find top executives, engineers, and go-to-market professionals. Next, we've got serial entrepreneur Michael Zang, who is currently the COO and co-founder at Candidate Labs, a new kind of search firm, and it uses technology to connect companies with really high quality sales and marketing candidates. And I've actually been in some of their cycles before as a candidate. It is a pleasure on that side, I can attest. Before Candidate Labs, he founded and took another company, TrueMaker, from seed stage to Series B to acquisition. So he's a seasoned executive. And then Ashley is the senior director of people at OpenComp, same company as me. And she recently joined our team about 2 months ago after an incredibly impressive career in people at high growth companies like Redfin and D2IQ. Speakers, welcome. It is so good to have you here.
Thank you.
Fabulous. So why are we here? I think we are here because it is pretty clear that the current job market isn't working for employees, and you could possibly say it's not working for employers either. And so we're going to talk about why most employees feel the need to leave their current employers due to compensation. As you can see on the slide, 2 in 3 employees are looking for work, and comp is the #1 reason why. And we're also going to cover things like what gets in the way of candidates saying yes, and how can employers and hiring managers solve for these things early on. So panelists, I'd love to start with talking about what is going on, what is fueling these trends. And Beth, if you could kick us off, that would be amazing.
Sure. So as far as fueling the trends right now, I mean, it's a supply and demand issue right now. There's a lot of money out there. Companies are still actively raising money. And what we've seen in probably the past, 2 to 3 years is that we have way more jobs than there are candidates. So it is this, fight for talent, which can lead to some tricky situations in compensation and negotiating. And the #1 thing that I tell founders over and over is that when you think about compensation and negotiation, you have to think about you are comping the role, not the person. And what I mean by that is before you even go to market with a new job, I get all of our founders, or whether it's a, COO, I get them to not just write the job description, but we go through it and we do a leveling exercise. And this really helps further problems so they don't start interviewing people that aren't at the right level. But when you have a founder who just starts interviewing people before actually setting the basic foundation, that's where you're going to have a big problem.
Ashley, Michael, what would you add there?
Yeah, I think one of the most common mistakes we see is similar to what Beth pointed out, which is that the role definition itself is oftentimes unclear. And, I think there's multiple ways to think about that. One is certainly from a compensation perspective, which is, I think, one of the data points that we provide a lot of, which is like, what are we actually seeing out there on the market? But I think the second really translates into having a firm sense of alignment between all the executives and the hiring team around what that role should be and what its mission, what its results what results it's going to deliver. So I think a framework that we commonly end up helping companies with is really framing a role around three dimensions, right? The missions, the outcomes, and the competencies of what you're going to drive that role towards. And that feeds ultimately into this leveling exercise that helps the entire interview team across across every candidate really assess clearly for, hey, what is the role we're hiring for? What's the impact they're going to have? And are the candidates we're meeting the right fit for the role? And ultimately that opens up avenues. If, let's say, we do want to go more senior, we do want to go more junior, do we want to maybe pivot some of the responsibilities? We have a very structured document that provides that foundation for a kind of a very high bandwidth conversation to take place, if that should be the case.
And the only thing I'll add is, I'm very focused on data. We have great comp tools out there. Nothing is perfect, but what we do have today, you'll hear me reference option impact, is that, the data doesn't lie. And when you present a founder with data and then he or she can use that in a conversation trying to close a candidate, it's very hard to personalize market data. So I really try to shift from focusing on what the candidate has done to, okay, let's just look at this job. There is some flexibility within a salary band, but we are trying to maintain internal equity in a fast-growing company. We don't want to create problems for the future head of HR or the future head of talent or total rewards person in a later stage company.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are great points, and part of it a lot of what's happening right now, and a lot of what you all just said is happening in the context of kind of an unprecedented environment that has fueled what's going on, right? Driven by a remote and distributed workforce that we've never kind of navigated before, and the questions today of how much is the market turning? If VC funding slowed down in Q1, how much should that impact Q2 and Q3 plans? So we're all taking a look at our hiring scenarios and needing to ask some important questions as we wait to kind of see where the world is going. So thank you for teeing that up. Before we get further into the topic, I would love for us all to put a stake in the ground on what our stance is on the question of this webinar, which is effectively, what do you think is the future of compensation negotiations? None at all? Is it definitely negotiations? Is it kind of a just right between the two somehow? So we'll give the audience a couple about a minute to answer the poll, but I'd love to hear from you panelists while we're doing that. And Ashley, if we could start with you, and then Beth will go to you next.
Yeah. So I think that you're never going to stop full negotiations, but I do think we'll start to see a decline on how much we're negotiating. You've got some local and legislative moves going on, right? Like in New York, for example, starting May 15th, you were supposed to start posting your salary bands in every job description. They've now pushed that to November. But if candidates have a sense up front of what they can expect to be paid, and you're having open conversations early about where you pick in the band someone for a role, I think it eliminates a lot of the confusion around their offer, right? My offer at OpenComp, complete transparency, I did not negotiate. My conversations with Tang, our CEO, were such that I understood why I was getting the offer, what the band was. And not only that, I had the data as an HR professional to know my value. So I think as candidates in the job market start to understand and get their hands on some of the data also to understand their value, and as companies meet them, by sharing openly in those first conversations where their bands are and why they land in certain areas, I think we'll start to see that negotiation dwindle down. But I don't think, you might have a candidate who's got the same offer from two companies. You've got to do something, right, to push a lever. So I don't think we'll get rid of them altogether. But I do see us starting to see a decline.
Thank you. Beth, what about you?
So I think there's always going to be negotiation because you have on both sides, employee side and employer side, they think by negotiating, they're going to get a better deal. So there will always be negotiation, but what's happening is that framework is becoming tighter and tighter because now we have so much more data through whether it's option impact, Radford, PAVE, OpenComp, that we are really working within a much tighter framework. I know we're not fully talking about best practices now, but one of the things that we do from the get-go, whether it's a VP role or a IC, is we coach our founders to give two offers. And actually, when I joined Homebrew, and I thought I was a really good negotiator, but I actually am not. When I got my offer, it was, a higher base, a lower equity, and then the flip. So what this does is it empowers the candidate and it cuts down on the back and forth because you're saying you either take A or B, there's no C. And really developing a rapport with the candidate and building trust from that first point of contact is going to give the employer all of the information they know to know what drives the candidate. So this all comes down to how risk averse is the person. And that's why giving those two offers, you're really empowering the candidate to either take some more risk or not.
Michael, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think compensation negotiations will continue, but my belief is they can be simpler, but they will not go away. I think there's a future where this can be far more data-driven and transparent, and we've seen some very effective high-growth companies really index towards setting the gold standard on this front. I think one thing that, as we all develop this muscle around how to be more data-driven and transparent compensation, one thing we should be aware of is that data can be vulnerable to misinterpretation, and kind of similar to what Beth said, we ourselves look at a lot of the tools in the market, Carta, PAVE. We have not used OpenComp, but we used option impact, VC, ECS, Radford. So we look at a lot of data, and sometimes I think what we see in practice is these tools give you data, but the data sets can be limited, the sample sizes can be small, founders can end up pulling the wrong filters for the wrong levels, and that itself can introduce a lot of friction into what they believe is a data-driven and transparent process, and oftentimes then come to heads with candidates who are maybe seeing other data points from what the market is yielding real time for what they believe their level of seniority is. So this is why compensation negotiations will need to continue. I think this is why, as we introduce more data into our own practices, one of the, I think the really important things to be mindful of is how is that data being vetted? How is it being used? And where could it inform me instead of, I think, create such a rigid foundation that leads to candidate fall off because they really believe the other companies being maybe too hardline about certain things. So those are just some of the things I think that are kind of worthy to be reminded of, even as we move towards this data-driven world.
Very valuable points. Thank you. Let's see what the audience says, and then keep going from there. Goodness, we have quite the split response. Almost equal representation across, which is interesting. Would love to hear in the chat what people think. Maybe to round out some of those answers. Like if it's neither, then what happens? I'd be curious to hear. And I think let's switch now into just more of the conversation part of the conversation. Before we move on, we got a question from the audience that I'll throw out for the panelists. This attendee has a company who has 3 offers with varying degrees, of base and bonus. And candidates end up wanting the highest base and bonus and try for a 4th offer. So they basically take the best of everything that's available. And the question is effectively, how would you all advise that they handle this in this scenario?
I'm happy to take the first part, which is if a candidate, presents 3 competitive offers, if they're not all seed stage, then the conversation is over. I'm only going to compare apples to apples. I love it when a candidate says, but I've got this offer from, startup, which is more than yours. And then I've got an offer from Google and Facebook. It's like, well, that doesn't matter. If you're going to be window shopping at this point, and compensation is the number one driver, don't be looking at a seed stage company. So I think you have to make sure you're comparing the proper stage of companies. I think it's very easy to just throw all your offers back at the founder or head of talent, with all this information, but they have to be the same stage company.
And I think too, the other thing is why are we having conversations with that candidate, right? I think it's really important early on when we're talking to candidates to understand what it is that they're looking for, to make sure they're right fit, because someone who is considering an offer from Facebook, we are ultimately way different as a Series A than a Facebook, right? So really understanding if we should be continuing on with some of those folks too. And it could be that the person just doesn't know, right? Maybe they've been at big companies and they're really struggling if it's time for a move to a startup. But I think also selling on that future, right, as to why you should be joining a Series A in comparison.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a critical question too, that we all have to kind of answer if we're thinking about startup world ever, is how small, how big, what kind of maturity, where do we belong? Some of it has to do with risk tolerance, some has to do with financial needs and so on. So it's, a lot of it is looking for people with the psychology that match your current position in the startup life cycle. Like you probably are hiring a very different mindset if you're hiring at a seed stage versus, Series D or E. You're much different profile. What I like about all of this, the divergence of all of our answers, is I think it illuminates the importance of the fact that the first time effectively that you are engaging in having a official professional relationship when you're discussing compensation, that's the first moment that you're really considering a quote unquote professional marriage, so to speak. And it's a very important moment that shifts, informs the arc of a relationship over the lifetime of your employment, right? Or your experience as a manager, or whatever your role. And that central focus on compensation in that moment really underscores the need to approach it with something that you can defend, with science to the degree that it's available, with some expertise, because you're right, data and insights are very different, right? We can't just rely on the data. So thank you for that. Anything else before I move on, Michael? It seems like you might have.
Yeah, I think I just saw the panel, the question asker clarify that what they're doing is they're putting out 3 offers, and the candidate is trying to negotiate and get the best of both worlds from a base salary and bonus perspective. So maybe to add my 1-minute tidbit there, we do see that with a lot of candidates who believe they have a lot of negotiating power. I think it is worth discussing internally, and this once again kind of goes back to aligning your internal team. How much are we willing to budge internally, right? And I think this is also related to running a robust evaluation process. Even if, let's say, you run 5 candidates through an evaluation process and all of them turn out to be great finalists and all of them check off all the boxes against the role definition you're hiring for, they are going to come in a long spectrum. You might have candidates who may be indexed towards the 90th percentile for the talent that you need. You might have other candidates who solidly hit the job marker, but aren't going to be kind of the superstars and the all-stars out there. And ultimately, something we end up advising a lot of our clients with is it really depends on the level and caliber of talent you want to bring into your organization. And something that truly top tier talent has on their plate is the ability to go out and command, let's call it 80th, 90th percentile equity and 90th percentile compensation if they even choose to go out and get 6 Series A offers or 6 Series B offers. And at a certain point, you have to decide internally within our compensation philosophy, are we willing to recognize talent for kind of that maybe exceptional nature and make an exception there? And you can always start from that data-driven perspective. You can always start by saying, look, we present 3 offers and our core philosophy compensation-wise is we do median equity, median salary, median bonuses. Here's the data that backs all of it up. But then I think from that perspective, understanding where other candidates might index along that spectrum should give you some additional flexibility that you have as an internal kind of tool in your back pocket there.
And to add to that, Michael, I think it's also important to talk about, look, base salary is one piece of the pie, equity is another. If you have a candidate you're trying to close and there is a delta, and maybe there is a reason the candidate has brought up early in the offer stage, they are, buying a home, they just had twins, again, it's all about developing rapport. you can get creative. Again, base salary is one piece of the pie. We've done sign-on bonuses where we've broken them out over the course of a year. So, you know, if there's a VP of finance who doesn't want everything to hit in the beginning, but you can get creative if you need to. But what you don't want to do is disrupt equity to the point that you're going to have so many future problems. And if you only get 2 years out of this candidate, you have to ask yourselves, was this really worth it? Because there may be attrition from other people. So you really have to be thinking about it long term. And I do believe you can get pretty creative. I have people who will tell me, but comp's not very creative. It actually is. And anyone who's worked in comp will tell you that.
Beth, I think that that's a really great point, because there is the aftermath that folks like myself have to deal with, right? You get someone who's completely out of the band and they're performing really well, and you go to promote them and they're already at the next band. They're already at the top of the next band. So you're giving them a 2% increase with the promotion. It doesn't feel good. Right. So being really,
and that person's probably not going to stay.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not valuing me. Well, we valued you a lot in the beginning. We made a mistake in the beginning. We did a wrong turn in the beginning. Right.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of early stage companies just literally make up equity numbers out of thin air at times, right? So a lot of the coaching we do, I think, centers around really getting them into a more data-driven methodology and helping, I think, put a dollar value on equity and like painting a scenario for what that future dollar value could look like. So once again, kind of moving towards a very, I would say, data-driven analytical way of coaching candidates to understand, here's how we want you to look at equity in the same way we look at it as well. So aligning everyone to the same page there.
Very important. We've actually mentioned a couple really important things over the last couple of minutes that I want to double click into. And the three things that I noticed are: one, let's dive into what comp philosophy is and how people need to approach that. The second is really around pay transparency. How do you need to think about communicating in your job post, your first conversation or interview cycle around your salary band that you've set? And then I'm blanking on the third. So the third will come to me while we talked about the first two. Ashley, would you mind maybe taking us through what is the comp philosophy? Like how do our listeners need to think about what that is and making sure that they can actually afford what they want to have as their philosophy?
Yeah, so comp philosophy is really, you understanding the market, understanding who you're competing against, understanding where your future growth is too, right? So if I know that I need to be shipping products right now, and that's the phase that's important for the business, right? I might not align myself and my market. I might not align my market ranges, my salary ranges, right? Against maybe the 30th percentile. If that's where I need to be beefing up my hiring, maybe I adjust that and bring it up. And I think it's important, as we've all kind of talked about, comparing apples to apples. When you are going to look at the market and you're looking at compensation data, and I was a customer of OpenComps before I joined, right? Looking at the market data and understanding that I'm comparing myself to other technology companies, comparing to a similar stage of funding, similar in size, right? And then understanding which roles you want to put your stake in the ground. Is the 40th percentile what I can afford in base compensation, or is it the 50th I can control? Which roles need to be more, because I know that I can't close candidates at that and I need to draw these up. So for us at OpenComp, with our comp philosophy, we do pay the technology org more, right? We know that right now we are in the business of shipping product and building product, and that's where we need to focus. And so I think for us, again, having those really clear conversations upfront with candidates about our compensation philosophy and about we bring you in at the midpoint. And we do make sure that we're communicating with candidates too when we go above the midpoint, right? So you need to have a framework in place as a company to say what roles is it that you're comfortable, what skill sets is it that you're comfortable in going above the 50th percentile when you're bringing folks in.
I always tell founders before they go to market with a job and start interviewing people, there's two things they absolutely need to have. One is a comp philosophy. Second is you have to have your benefits, and everybody who's on the interview schedule needs to be able to articulate those benefits.
Well said. Michael, anything that you would add on this topic? I'm sure this comes up a lot with your clients.
Yeah, since so many of our clients are high growth startups, I think one additional X factor we typically find ourselves leading the discussion around is actually around career progression, right? I think in terms of compensation philosophy, we do see a lot of candidates get stuck in like, what's now right in front of me? What can I get for my next offer here? And we really encourage candidates to think about this from a very holistic perspective, which is, look, In 10 years, you could be a C-level. In 10 years, you could be a senior VP somewhere, right? Think about kind of how this next opportunity accelerates your career. Think about kind of how that org chart looks, where you could fit into the org chart as you grow throughout the organization. And even if you are, let's say, either taking a compensation decrease or comparing apples to apples, one of the things that you can kind of really, I think, use as an evaluation mechanism is how fast does it accelerate my career towards my career goals. And we often find that it's only until we introduce that question do candidates even think about a job opportunity from that perspective. And I think it's something that even internal people and talent teams start thinking about, because we definitely noticed that, certain candidates are very attracted to the fact that, yeah, this company has a stellar trajectory of internal promotions, that their existing layer of leadership saw immense career growth themselves. And those are things you can point to. Those become immense selling points beyond just what's the dollar value of the equity, my cash, my bonus that I'm getting in this organization, because those aren't those are just static point in time data points that can quickly change at a high growth company.
Solid points. I actually, partially because of the nature of OpenComp's technology, but since I've made offers here and I've hired 10 folks since I've joined, I believe is the number, it might be 9, but I make sure that whenever I talk to someone in a first conversation, I'm telling them what our compensation philosophy is, where we get our data from, as well as what that specific range is and what it might look like for their career progression down the line, to your point. And then also in the examples that we have of people that we've already kind of realized, like, hey, you're actually performing above where we thought you might be, like, I do make sure to mention that too, because it's a very great proof point to position yourself as a team and a culture that really recognizes and awards performance. I think it's a really good point you've made. What about pay transparency and pay bands? What, particularly, I think most of the audience probably knows this, but 13 states have new legislation that requires that you divulge pay bands, which is a dollar range that you pay for a particular role in your job postings. And it's increasingly something that at least we hear from candidates that they're wanting to see. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, like, what are the considerations that hiring managers and employers need to have along those lines, and what are best and worst practices that kind of ladder up to them as well.
I think Michael referenced it earlier. I mean, if you're going to give somebody data, make sure you fully can explain it so that they can understand it, rather than, I would never just share data without having a live conversation. And I actually usually don't put it in, a PDF. What I'll do is jump on a Zoom call with a founder or maybe even a candidate, because we do help close candidates. I will show them the bands. And then they understand, oh, well, that's what other, Series A or seed companies will pay. And then back to internal transparency, I actually wrote up something, again, I'll reference on our website, homebrew.co. Some companies are very, very transparent about comp, others are not. What I always say is, look, people are going to talk. When you're a small company, people talk. So regardless, people know, but there are pros and cons to each.
I think educating your hiring managers, educating your hiring teams too is so important, again, about how to talk about the bands, because we will in initial outreach occasionally throw in, here's the salary range. And what will happen is we'll see candidates, they pigeonhole themselves to the top. Okay, that's where I'm going to come in. And again, being able to have the conversation, and it's harder to put that in an email or on a job description, right, on a website, about where you land in the range, but making sure that all of your folks who are in the hiring process are educated to talk about that is super important.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that actually speaks a bit to Enmo's question earlier about the offering of 3 and then candidates wanting to take the best from what was offered. Ariane just asked what the pros and cons are to transparency. And I think, Ariane, it's an amazing question. I think I would actually add a question before there as well, is what is the definition, right? Because pay transparency can mean everybody, Sarah knows Matt's salary and Matt knows Sarah's exact salary, or it could mean that a pay band of a particular role. How do your organizations define pay transparency right now? And then we can get into pros and cons.
I can speak for OpenComp, which is, in my very early interviews with Chang and others on the leadership team, I asked the question, do you guys openly share? Do your team members know what each other make? And the reason I asked that is because I did not want to join an organization who did that. I think that it is a mistake to openly share because you constantly then have employees clamoring against each other. Well, why is this person making this when I came in? I'm the same level. Well, sure, maybe you're same level, maybe your breadth of experience, maybe someone's on the cusp of promotion, et cetera. And I for me, pay transparency is not knowing what my peer is making. It is really understanding why I am paid the way that I am paid.
I echo that sentiment. I think there's a lot of tools in the toolbox you can deploy outside of just sharing everyone's actual compensation. I think one is, how often are you doing performance reviews and re-leveling everyone for market compensation, issuing equity refreshes. A lot of those are practices companies are now putting in place earlier and earlier that ensure that there's a proper cycle. As part of that, I think we've talked about this several times, but ensuring the entire company understands the philosophy of how pay works to that company is the foundation you want everyone to be on the same page with. Because if the company is following that philosophy and they're doing regular compensation reviews and each of those data points are backed up by other data sources, everyone understands that, hey, my pay is now being oriented around a common process that can ensure equitable and fair kind of compensation. And it's not about me versus someone else, but more so is it being kind of run through that same process in the end.
Sure, and I can give a quick rundown of the pros and cons. I just found what I was looking for. So some of the pros are employee morale. People know their worth. They feel empowered. People feel trusted when they're given information. Trust leads to engagement, which can help retention. Salary data can be used as a recruiting tool for benchmarking against other companies. And salary transparency can protect against gender and racial bias. How? If you think certain people are better negotiators, does this mean they should get paid more at hand? No, it just means they're better negotiators. And then some of the cons, and this will be shorter, information can be dangerous if used out of context. We've talked about that. If employees have access to information they don't fully understand, they may make incorrect assumptions. If context isn't provided regarding the why, the nuances of roles and job families, people will be confused, frustrated, and angry. The actual numbers aren't the issue at this point. It's a lack of understanding regarding how the company came up with the formula to get to the numbers.
Well, and compensation is so personal, right? We talked about having 3 different offers, and your approach, Beth, which is you give 2 offers. You give one that's the high equity and the lower base, one that's the higher base and lower equity, right? So it is so personal, and it can be dangerous.
Great. Let's shift gears a little bit and bring it back to comp negotiations specifically. So Ashley, I would love to hear from you on what are the shifts you've seen in comp negotiations, whether it's something that you have seen across employers, right, at D2IQ or now OpenComp, or more from the candidate side, or maybe both.
Yeah, consistently over the past few years, I've seen specifically in engineering, lower level in engineering, really, a lot of people talk about their compensation. And so if they're on a team with maybe a senior or staff level and they feel that they are contributing or they feel that they are doing similar jobs and they understand what someone is making on that team, that might be at a different level. And again, they're comparing themselves thinking I bring the same value. What I'm seeing is those lower levels are coming in and expecting a much higher compensation package. And so what we've had to do in the past is, pull up the bottom of the range for the L2s and kind of condense down from the top. But I'm certainly seeing the lower levels getting a higher wage. And I think, some of that is really selling them on the opportunity that Michael was talking about their career, right? What this will do for your career. And if you can sell them more on the opportunity, especially at the more junior levels, I think, you start to see a shift of people starting to accept offers within the range. But I'm certainly seeing that with junior technical folks.
I think too, from what I've seen from the data in our platform, some of it depends as well on the type of role. Like right now, engineers on average are getting 4 to 6% increases to stay in seat and 14 to 16% in our database to change roles. That's definitely not the case across different departments, in other parts of the organization. So it probably relates a bit to role. Beth, you had alluded to some of the best practices that Homebrew recommends to its portfolio, but I'd love to double click into those because there's some really good ones in there. What are they?
Sure. Well, I think the first one, and I've talked about both these, but I'm happy to go deeper. One, you have to develop trust and rapport early in the process. That comes at the initial point of contact. And I mean, I'll talk to founders that are about to make an offer to somebody and I'll say, okay, so, what drives them, what's important to them? And they'll say, I don't know, we haven't talked about that yet. And again, there's a way to find that out without saying how much money do you make. I mean, obviously you can't say that in most states, but the question or the way I like to frame it is, well, what drives you? What motivates you? But I just think once you have that trust and rapport, you'll start getting information from a candidate. A lot of time it's the spouse that's either coaching or, giving them information. I mean, that's the other tricky thing about when we talk about negotiation in general. Most people are getting coaching and some of it's really bad. And it's very easy for me to spot somebody who's getting coaching because they're not coming to me with any numbers. They're really just coming to me with how great they are, all their degrees, which may not even be relevant for the job. And then the number two, best practice, again, let's make it easy. Let's keep it simple and let's give the candidate some power. We'll give 2 offers. We don't do 3. 3 to me seems complicated. I like the idea of 2. Maybe somebody has, reasons why 3 is better. But I think if you do those 2 things, you're on a really good track.
Michael, same question for you. And then we've got a couple back questions from the audience that I'll ask as well. But what are the things that you would recommend from the host of high growth companies that Candidate Labs partners with that they should consider putting in their arsenal as a best practice?
Yeah, we find ourselves creating a lot of equity calculators for seed and Series A companies. And that is because we have seen early stage companies oftentimes just throw equity offers out there and under deliver on painting a picture for what that equity is worth right now, but also what the scenarios for that equity could be worth in the future. And something we coach a lot of candidates around and founders too, who are issuing those offers is the equity that you get in this role could far exceed all the cash comp you may combine in those 4 years of vesting alone. So both portraying the equity in its most attractive and understandable light and having all the parties aligned to kind of what these scenarios could be is one of the most important areas that I find that founders continue to just maybe throw a number out there and expect the candidate to understand. And when there isn't that shared philosophy, it leads to just, I think, a worse candidate experience, but also a worse conversion rate for the company trying to make these offers and put them out there. And this is something that can have impact for everything ranging from individual contributor roles where the equity is very much a cherry on top to executives, which is even more important because that in the end becomes a game-changing amount of, I think, compensation that is multitudes more than I think the cash compensation they could ever command. So we have seen at the top end, like at the gold standard, some very excellently designed equity calculators, either built in Excel or sometimes using third-party HR tech tools. Some of these have even accounted for things like tax consequences as well as a result of exercising options or exercising early or, kind of getting stock versus options as well. These, I think, create transparency, but also understandability in equity, which continues to be kind of one of these areas where we routinely run into serial VPs who I think you would expect would understand equity very well. And the questions that we sometimes get out of the kind of the one-on-one conversations we have indicate there's still a gap in fully understanding how this world works. So that's my own learning, which is this is a world that always benefits from just more and more shared context and having clear and clearer conversations.
Yes, absolutely.
And the last best practice we use, and it's sort of a follow on what Michael was saying, is when we're trying to close a candidate, and you could tell there's still a lot of questions around the value of the equity, we get somebody from the board or, one of the investors to actually talk to the candidate. So it's really a sell call. But the power of having somebody who's been an investor for 10, 20 years to be able to talk to a candidate does a couple things. One, it shows that people are valued and that an investor is going to make the time to talk to somebody who may not be a VP. I mean, we've done it with ICs. It doesn't really matter. If somebody is curious about something that we can help alleviate any ambivalence, we're going to do it. So Hunter and Satya my partners have amazing close rates when we get them on the phone with candidates because they're living this.
Yep, great point. We've got a couple good questions from the audience before we wrap this up with our takeaway slides. I'll start with this one because it's related to this topic of equity. And the question is roughly what percent of startups share with candidates what their stock option grant is as a percentage of total shares outstanding? So for instance, if they have 10,000 options, is that worth 0.4% of total shares outstanding?
In my line of work, I see this as almost all companies we work with are sharing this information. And I think you can share this information with the right context and I think end up creating a common foundation for understanding, right? I think if it's shared without context, it's easy for an employee to look at it and say, well, 14 basis points, gosh, that seems really low. I feel like a 1% employee, why can't I get that? But if you share it with the right context, which is, look, here's what Series A companies are offering marketing manager level candidates, in terms of equity. And hey, we happen to raise a pretty large Series A, around $30 million. So our valuation is actually higher from a post-money perspective than your typical Series A. Here's what that package is actually worth from a dollar perspective right now. And here's what it could be worth over the course of 4 years. That's, I think, the right context to be like, yeah, and by the way, yes, it's 14 bips, but don't focus on don't focus on the percentage you have as a slice of a pie. Think about growing that pie as part of the company. And that's where everyone wins, right? So I think that conversation really needs to go down a pathway like that. So just getting information tossed out there and leaving it vulnerable to misinterpretation or emotional reaction to that number.
Context is very important there, yes. What about, so moving to the question that was, Beth, you responded to on the chat already, but let's dive into it together. The topic of geo pay bands, right? Like where you're paying a distributed and remote workforce. This is a question we're all kind of facing right now, and it does boil down to comp philosophy. But the question effectively is, how do we decide if where someone lives should be factored into their starting pay? And if so, how much? Good, I know, easy question.
All I can say is we do adjust to geography. These are early stage companies. So the salaries are, base pay is very important to people. As I said, it's a big piece of the pie. And if somebody is moving to a state where the tax implications are, going to make a difference, we absolutely, will encourage to adjust. It's really the bigger companies, that are not adjusting. But we have to be really flexible as seed stage investors. I can't speak to much later stage companies, but I mean, there are consulting firms. I know Terrain Advisors does a ton of work on this, but for our early stage companies, we really have to be flexible and adjust because of the tax implications in different states.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a surprise at different points in time. What about pay bands? So the question is, how can you implement pay bands where there are earlier team members whose pay is an outlier, particularly when it's much higher? Obviously, this is the purpose of pay bands, but if you've got people outside of them, once you institute them, what is the way that we recommend addressing that?
I think you have to have open dialogue with those team members about what the future looks like for their pay there. The dialogue needs to be about why they came in at a certain range, right? What we're trying to accomplish by bringing them in. I think it needs to also include what that will look like in the future. Is the future going to be a 10% increase every year at your anniversary? Probably not, but making sure that they understand again and are educated as to why the increases they're seeing or will not see are. Because the worst feeling is to come up on your 1-year anniversary and now there's pay bands and then you get nothing and no one tells you why. So opening those communication lines, I think, is super important.
Makes sense.
Another consideration is early employees are oftentimes very generously comped on equity, if not over comp, because that's when I think equity practices are the least developed. So as you have these review conversations with your earliest employees, I think reminding them that value of equity is actually several times more than the employee in a similar role we just hired a month ago. And that is, I think, part of the value of what you continue to get out of vesting at this company, continue to grow your career. Even if, let's say, your compensation was over leveled on the cash side, and you're not going to see as much percentage boost increases. I think helping them understand from the perspective of total rewards, like you're actually in a great spot. And, like this is not a spot you want to give up on, is I think good. I think executives tend to be savvier around this. I think executives understand that they will either be leveled over or just outright, I think, kind of removed from the organization if like they end up being the wrong fit at the wrong stage, because they've been, I think, they've had long enough careers to typically understand that. And it's not atypical for us to get called in, right? Kind of company raises a Series B and says, look, our head of sales isn't cutting it anymore. Great player coach, but just doesn't know how to even build a 10-person team. And I think that's where we end up giving a lot of coaching to our own candidates, letting them know, like, look, you don't want to over negotiate on compensation, because especially as you get into the more senior levels, those expectations only go up. Like, sure, you want the CRO level compensation, but are you actually ready to do the job of a CRO? Or is your company going to be looking for that replacement within 6 months of you getting there because you aggressively negotiated on compensation, but you're stepping into a role that, you're just not quite built out for yet. But maybe with 2 more years of seasoning, you're going to be a rock star in that role. So,
fair point. Another question is, what is a good offer acceptance rate? And the question made me laugh. It says, we target 85% or higher. Are we crazy? I can speak to that some, and then we'll pass the mic. From what I've read, 65% is the technology industry average. So we were excited at OpenComp to find out that our customers have an 83% success rate in offer acceptance, which is pretty high, at least in our opinions. But I guess we're about to put that one over the fire and see what Michael and Beth think.
I talked to a Sequoia-backed Series C company that hired about, I think, 115 people in Q1. And they said they had a market leading rate of around 85% across all divisions, including engineering and sales. So I was actually quite curious. I was like, how did you end up having an 85% offer acceptance rate? Q1 was a pretty hot time for hiring. And they detailed a bunch of best practices. One of which I forgot to point out is the consistent use of an offer deck and taking people through a narrative presentation that connects them emotionally, once again, at the end of that candidate journey to why join this company. Why do we exist as a company? What is the problem we're solving? And how are you going to contribute to that? And I think really making that clear. That, they said, was one of the biggest unlocks they enacted between like Q3 and Q1 of this past year that really enabled them to absolutely make candidate experience stellar. And I think introduce that kind of narrative component that oftentimes is missing from the more sanitized, like, here's your comp package, what do you want? Let's negotiate, right? So I think that, I encourage a lot of companies to think like, hey, what does our end stage candidate experience look like? Are we actually doing something stellar over there? Or is it something that's more just average?
I think it's very stage agnostic too. I mean, with seed stage, we definitely have a lot of first-time founders, so there's a lot of education around that, and they're not as, some of them haven't done this before. But I would guess 65 to 70. But if I looked at just the past 18 months versus the past 7 years I've been doing this, I think this year is probably a little lower.
It is much more of a candidate market, so that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a supply and demand issue.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, or not glad to hear that. That doesn't surprise me, is what I meant to say. I'm looking at questions as I'm speaking. Multitasking is never smart. We have one question around international markets. This person is calling in from LATAM and is curious how much he or she, it's an anonymous attendee, should trust the data that they see on some of the platforms that we've mentioned today that are more focused on the US.
So we're investing in Latin America, and this has been a challenge for me in the past year. There is not a single comp tool that has mastered this yet because there are so many new fintech companies in Mexico City, and we've got a real estate tech company in Brazil. There's just not, the sample size is too small. What I've actually found is really helpful is talking to people that are in country that are recruiters. For example, Robert Walters has a big Latin American division. So I reached out to the head of that division and he was able to help me. But this comp tool doesn't exist because this is so new. I think 5 years from now, it will be different, but we're all struggling with Latin America data right now.
Yep, I echo Beth's kind of feedback there. International data is very hard to come by, and best course of action is to supplement that with what is the real-time market dictating and having reliable sources being able to corroborate that for you.
Yeah.
And leverage information from your candidates. If they have other offers, like get into it and just keep track of this kind of information because it's really helpful and nobody's doing it well yet.
Yeah, when I've been international, that's what we've had to do too, because the market, the data just wasn't there. So we had recruiters track what are the offers that they're seeing, and even leaning on agency recruiters that were boots on the ground in those locations. And what are you seeing? Does this feel out of line?
Yeah.
Great. I think we've made it through most of the questions. So we're going to go back to the scheduled program. Keep them coming, folks, though. This is great. There is no need for us to go through our pre-prepared content if you've got other things you want to talk about. But we'll go back and start looking at our slides again. And I think, so as I've been listening, as we've all been listening, I think what's clear is that this is an important topic with a lot of nuance, regardless of your stance exactly on, comp negotiations, yes or no, or something in between. And in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the best practices that we've talked about in a summarized way for you to view. Generally, I think it sounds like in this market, when employees have offers to join other companies, whether that's yours or you're talking about losing an employee, you really need to think a lot about matching or losing an employee and what that cost is. And if we can go back to the last slide, that would be great. So would just love to talk really quickly. These are placeholder costs. We've seen from some research that it costs a company 6 to 9 months to replace an employee's salary. If it's an executive level, it's more like 213% is what the data says. And obviously for more senior roles, that can take longer to fill, as Michael can attest, and as well as Beth. Question for the panelists on this particular topic. Do those statistics seem directionally accurate is the first question. And then second, if you're in the position as an employer where someone's got an offer to go somewhere else, how should people think about trying to keep the talent they've got versus letting them go?
I can start by saying, I think the hours of recruiting time, it varies by role. I think the months set back and output, though, I think that's actually probably greater than 4 months, if I had to guess. In terms of counter offers, I'm against counter offers. Once an employee has already made up their mind that they want to leave and they've started looking in the market, they've already got excited about a new opportunity, they've already signed an offer saying they're going to go join, their mind is made up. I also think you've lost the trust already. If you come back and say, I will meet that, or I will exceed that offer. Well, if you were willing to do that, then why didn't you pay me that at my last performance increase? Why did it take me wanting to leave in order for you to match this compensation package? So I am someone who does not believe in that. And I also think there are times though where it's useful. Sure, if you have something, a big project coming up and you have 2 months to execute and this person is crucial to it, in those cases, maybe it makes sense to do a counter and actually meet it or exceed it. But I do find that long-term, even if you've gotten, in my experience, folks who say yes and they want it staying and they take your counter offer, you lose them in 6 months, within 6 months. So it's a short-term problem that you're solving for. And in cases, you may need to do that.
I agree with Ashley 100%. And what I always say to a candidate who comes back to me and says, hey, I'm going to stay at, my current company, I go back and I look at my notes from the first conversation and I said, well, what you told me, the reason why you were looking at our company at this stage is because of A, B, and C. And I pose the question, okay, are you going to get A, B, and C? And they can't really answer the question because no, that's, what they were hoping to leave. But yeah, statistically, people who go back to their companies with a counter, it's like they usually leave in like 3 to 6 months. So.
Yeah, I'll talk about counter offers. We found that the stickiest kind of counter offer that is very challenging to win against is one where they promote or move the employee to a new role that better aligns with their care abouts. Because at that point, it's not even about the compensation anymore. It's about satisfying the employee's base desire to, I think, advance their career in some other way. And oftentimes, employees, when they get these kind of counter offers, it might be because they don't have enough transparency around when is the next promotion cycle coming, or hey, how are the executives thinking about the org structure and how do I fit into it from a 6-month and 12-month time frame? And oftentimes when companies suddenly have an all-star employee say, hey, I got 4 other offers for other roles, their willingness, I think, accelerates some of that in recognition of the employee's ability to make an impact that presents an unbeatable, I think, situation that like no other company can match, because at that point it's a different role. So that I think is something worth considering for like, I think your great talent, which is like, hey, like how much have we succeeded and failed to communicate to them like their fit within our organization long term? Is that maybe why they're going out and shopping around for other offers? And what can we do to paint a better picture for them for how they can stick around in our organization and make an impact beyond just, you know, compensation itself, right? So I think that's something worth considering, and that we've seen some companies deploy very successfully to retain like absolute top tier talent.
Thank you. Let's wrap up by talking about the best practices one more time, and then we will close off on benefits and what happens from here. So the next slide gets into the best practices part of things. And so these are all the things, folks, that we've said today. And some of you may be visual like me, so that's why I'm putting it in front of your eyes. It's really having that pay range defined, sharing it in the job posting, as well as the first screen with candidates. If you're in a performance review situation or a merit cycle, that's a time to mention it as well. I think the key thing that I heard that you all say is really the importance of communication around helping people understand what they're hearing, right? Like business priorities or company stage, someone's particular department really shapes what an offer is made of or what a compensation package is made of. So that is a very important piece that I am at least taking away from today's conversation. And then making sure you have a good source of data that's reliable, where you're looking at companies in your peer set, where it's employer reported information, not employee reported information, and being able to explain your comp philosophy. Those are all things that we talked about today. Anything that I missed, I think we're almost at time, so I'm gonna rush through that part. If I need to be interrupted, please interrupt me. But in terms of benefits, I want to close out with the last question for the audience on this slide around pay equity. It's not as integral to the topic today, but it is something that's top of mind for candidates. It's top of mind for employers right now, particularly those that live in the 13 states. How do we define, how do you make sure that you offer fair and competitive pay as an employer? What are the ways that you can architect that? Did we cover most of it on the prior slide? Okay, great. Let's close out with what happens from here. Desmond, if we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you so much. If you could give the audience one piece of advice, Beth, Ashley, and Michael, what would it be?
Before you go to market with a job, make sure the founder / hiring manager fully understands what the role is, what the competencies of the role are, not just the level, and knows that there are a lot of advantages to working within a, very structured salary band.
Thank you. Michael, what about you?
Oh, sorry. Ashley, did you speak?
Yeah, I would go ahead.
First. You go first.
Okay, mine would be education. So educating not just your hiring teams, your hiring managers, but also educating the candidates that you're speaking to, again, about your pay philosophy.
I think mine is just context. All the data in the world doesn't matter if it's not wrapped in the correct context, and it actually has a tendency to introduce even more friction. So data is only as powerful as I think the context you ultimately set it in to help candidates understand how they should look at it. Well
said. Thank you. Folks, that is all for today. As you can see on this, the last slide, you can sign up for a free account at OpenComp that'll give you access to a lot of the data and the insights that we've been talking about today. We also have a Slack community that'll be sent to you in your follow-up emails called High Growth Matters, where executives get together and talk about the challenges and the best practices that they're seeing every day. And if you care about pay equity, we have an organization of 250 CEOs that are getting together to end gender pay disparity in their organizations by 2027. And as a thank you for joining, you will receive a gender pay equity report for free. Panelists, thank you so much. This is a great conversation. Audience, thank you for being so engaged. We'll see you next month.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Bye, everybody.